Hi, guys. The gender war is a regretful thing, producing a litany of different kinds of damage. But to be fair, and to see the silver lining, there's also a lot of comedy being created. And by comedy, I mean some really funny shit like college classes that teach there being a couple of hundred different genders that you can choose from. Then there's the hysterical idea that we live in a culture that condones and approves of rape. Like high schools and colleges all had rape teams and our best rapists go for Olympic gold. Now, admittedly, feminists don't get the comedy in that one. Matter of fact, they think it's downright serious, which is, of course, all the funnier to people who can think. And don't forget the comic gold of zombie statistics. With feminists spouting repeatedly debunked ideas with the wide-eyed absolute certainty of 5-year-olds gushing about Santa Claus. That's the image I get whenever I see a feminist talk about the gender wage gap with a straight face, or when they point to their own shortcomings and claim they were caused by patriarchy. And as funny as all that is, there's something even funnier. A lot funnier. When it comes to the unintendedly funny shit coming out of the gender wars, there is nothing more side-splittingly hilarious than feminists who will look you dead in the eye and claim that women can do anything men can do. Well, with the possible exception of the women who make fools out of themselves trying to prove it. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Apparently, a saying going around in Poland is that feminism ends when a woman needs to get a refrigerator moved to the 3rd floor. It seems that little nugget of wisdom didn't sit well with Polish feminists, so they set out to prove it wrong. This team of 4 of them managed to move a small refrigerator up 3 flights of stairs and then posed for a victory photo that would go viral on social media. I found this on a tweet, by the way, and the person posting it pointed out that it was a job easily done by 2 men, and that the women had only proved that 4 women possibly had the same power as half that many men, that they could do 50% of what men could do, and they were on social media bragging about it. Now, think about that. What does it say about society if women feel triumphant and braggadocious because they assume the world will collude with them by acting like they did something significant when they didn't and couldn't? And to be frank, even within the context of this completely hollow victory, we are being way too generous. I'm 61 years old. Give me a dolly and I could get that fridge up those stairs by myself. 20 years ago, I could have done it without breaking a sweat. And 30 years ago, I could have managed it without a dolly. Think not? Check out this guy manhandling what looks to be a similar-sized refrigerator. He's not a particularly big man. He's not unusually well-built or all that muscular. He's just an average dude who needs to move a refrigerator. So he does it, using one hand because he's steering a bicycle with the other. I touched on this subject just recently in another video I did, linked below, titled The MRM versus Feminism, It's About Adulthood, where I recounted the story of a female boat mechanic who was handicapped by the fact that she couldn't figure out how to fix a boat without a man to help her. Nonetheless, she glowed in her accomplishment, radiant in her sense of victory for all women. And why? Because she managed to follow a man's instructions after failing on her own. The triumphant look on her face said it all. It's the same dumb fucking look on these women's faces who moved a refrigerator upstairs despite the fact that the biggest challenge was actually fitting all 4 of them and a refrigerator into the same stairwell. If the world didn't participate in a charade with these women and pretend that they had done something more than just mediocre, they'd be too embarrassed to pose for that picture. This doesn't just happen in Poland. And as my experience on the boat proved, it's not just something reserved for social media. In 1973, during the height of second-wave feminism, and when I was in my mid-teens, the world was utterly transfixed by a tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. King was a highly ranked women's tennis player, and at 29 years old was in the peak physical condition of her life. Riggs was a 55-year-old former professional player who spent his time leading up to the match eating, drinking, and having sex with tennis groupies. Yes, there is such a thing, or at least there was. Anyway, the match between the two was billed as the Battle of the Sexes, and I recall clearly that hype surrounding it was every bit as intense and pervasive as an Ali Frazier prize fight, and perhaps more. When King won, edging Riggs out in 2 or 3 sets, the world went crazy. I've never seen so many fist pumps nor so much jubilation in the 45 years since that match. It was hailed as a victory for women's tennis and lauded as proof, of course, that women could compete with men at anything. In other words, the outcome triggered mass delusion across Western culture, with millions of people believing fully that a match between the 29-year-old female at the peak of physical conditioning and an out-of-shape old man 25 years past his prime was a fair way to compare the sexes. And I suppose that should be a good way to measure, if you're capable of looking at it objectively. That is a big if for human beings, though, who appear largely incapable of looking at anything about the sexes objectively. The whole thing should have been obvious to the world. You see, the first time that Riggs challenged King to a match, she declined. So instead he played 30-year-old Margaret Court, then the top-ranked woman player in the world. In that match, instead of partying and sleeping around, he spent the lead-up to the contest working out and practicing his game. He destroyed Court in 2 straight sets, 6-2, 6-1. Riggs, who was a top-ranked tennis professional in the 1940s, trounced the very best woman player in the world in the early 1970s. And it's the same way across the board. We have sex divisions in all sports for one simple reason. It's because women can't compete with men at literally any sport. If you want to know why in the world of professional basketball that the NBA has to underwrite the WNBA, just watch the women play sometime. And if in watching them you start feeling all alone, it's probably because you are. They have to be subsidized by the men because they don't have a decent paying audience. And they don't have a paying audience because compared to male basketball players, well, that's my point. There is no comparing them to male basketball players. And as long as we're being totally frank about all this, we know that it's not limited to sports or even just physical abilities. When it comes to positions of what blue pillars call power, CEOs, scientists, Nobel recipients, Fields Medal winners, anywhere geniuses do better than the average person, men dominate. The fact is that there are many, many more male geniuses than female. The supporting data is linked below for the doubters. Truth tell, I could go much further than this. I could talk about the great thinkers of our history, the world-class artists and musicians, and the conversation wouldn't change very much at all. But I'm not going to do that because despite what some may think, I'm not in that woman versus men contest and not trying to produce any kind of so there about men being better than women. Men and women are different. And my point is that if you can accept that we're different, then you can honor those differences and figure out that you don't have to compete with anyone. There's nothing to prove, and the contest just breeds contempt. It's just another reason that feminism is cancer. We have a whole society of women looking down on themselves compared to men because that is what feminism sold them. Who but feminists would have put on that incredibly stupid display of gloating over moving a refrigerator upstairs? Feminism claims to enhance women's empowerment. They have had 50 years and billions of tax dollars to meet that goal, and what have they done? They've encouraged women to get in a dick measuring contest with people who actually have dicks. You'd think that feminists could learn a thing or two from the men's movement. We encourage men to disengage from this kind of self-judgment and to value ourselves as we are, regardless of any of this nonsense. After all, pretty much anything women want to do is available to them. Nobody is stopping them. Well, unless the big, bad, invisible patriarch in the sky is scheming against you. The thing is, though, if more women quit listening to feminists and spread the radical idea of not having a chip on your shoulder with men, they might find that someday the world would open to something even more radical: equal valuing. The idea that all human beings, regardless of any perceived abilities, have intrinsic worth. That we don't need to turn life into a pissing contest, and that indeed we shouldn't, especially when we can see that everybody is already losing.